What's up everyone, my name is Mark Hawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with the new Sony 4K X1000V action camera, and we're going to put it up against the AS200V, and we're going to take these guys out of the noisy city, and we're going 2 hours north to Big Bear Mountain, so let's get out there. And you can use any of these quick links and jump to the section you're most interested in. And there's a lot of features to cover, so sit back and we'll start playing them all. Now, if any of this footage looks familiar and you've watched one of our other comparisons, it's because we're filming with 4 cameras at the same time to get more done, so let's get to it. So I wanted to apologize before we get too deep into this video for it taking so long to actually surface. There were a few things that I wanted to go back and refilm with our stabilization tests with these 2 cameras, but we'll kind of get more into that in a little bit. We do have a lot of stabilization tests to go over and stuff like that, but we're going to start off by taking a look at what each camera does best at 30 frames per second. So no matter what resolution, it's basically just what is the max type of specs we can get out of filming at 30 frames per second. I feel that's a good baseline to start at. Now with the X1000V, we have the XAVC-S mode enabled, which is basically our Pro mode, which gives us a higher bit rate. Now with the X1000V, we can get a bit rate of 100 megabits a second, and that's roughly 675 megabytes per minute of footage. So if you have a micro SD card, you can do the math and see how many minutes of footage you'll get on that. Now with the AS200, we have, again, XAVC-S mode turned on, and we're going to get that higher bit rate, so we're going to get a better quality of footage, and that's going to be about 370 megabytes per minute. So at the time of recording this, the AS200V retails for roughly $270 to $300, while the X1000V retails for around $500. Now the X1000V is capable of shooting at 4K, it has a higher bitrate obviously, and it has more frame per second options. At 4K, the depth of field and the focal distance look great, the sharpness and clarity are phenomenal for any action camera. It is priced a little high, but you are getting a lot of range out of this camera in most departments. Now when you look at the AS200V, it's not far off, but we're going to zoom in here just to sort of amplify some of the issues we're going to see in the differences. So if we take a look at the mountains in the far distance, you'll notice on the AS200V they're a little muddier, it's a little softer and stuff like that. If we start looking at the trees in the foreground here, you'll notice that there's a good amount of smudginess in the AS200, and if you look at the X1000V, we can basically start to see individual branches, trunks and stuff like that. There's a lot more detail in the snow. If we look at the mountains in the far distance on the left side of the screen, you can see all the little trails and crevices that creep down each of the mountains. Now the one thing that might not be apparent when we're comparing these 2 cameras side by side is what the kind of differences in the color profile are to the natural environment. But the nice benefit is here, we can just look at these color profiles and just judge if we think it's a nice image, not is it a nice image compared to this other camera. Because both of these cameras basically have the same color profile, and we have 2 color profile options. We can film with this vivid color mode, which is different from previous cameras, from like the AS30 and the AS15. The AS200V and the X1000V have a very sort of rich color palette, but it's not super rich in saturation. It's a little brighter than previous cameras, and there are some differences to the other color profile mode, which is flat color mode. The one downside to these cameras, though, is field of view. You really don't have any field of view options when you're filming with video. The only thing we can do is enable steady shot, which is what we've done here, and what that's going to do is it's actually going to reduce a lot of the vibration, which we'll get into later, but it's actually going to reduce the sort of lens distortion we see on the side, because when we cut back to this wider shot, there's a lot of lens distortion. You'll see it as the cars leave the screen and stuff like that. When we have steady shot, we lose a lot of that, but the problem is we also get some of the issues inherent with steady shot, which is if the camera is locked off, it has a tendency to drift sometimes, and it would be really nice to see some field of view options, but both of these cameras have that same issue. Again, the colors are very rich. The stones in the back are kind of close to that in reality. The sky looks a really nice rich blue. The reds and the whites are maybe a little punched up, a little more than my taste, but it's still a really good layout. It looks beautiful. One of the main reasons why we brought the camera up to Big Bear is because filming in snow is incredibly hard. Now I know most of you guys are probably watching this in maybe the summer months, but it's a really good test to just show you what the range of each of these cameras is. Now when you're filming in the snow, there's a lot of reflective light hitting the snow and then bouncing into the camera, and what the camera has to do is it has to compensate for the really bright ground and then everything else in the environment. So if it goes too far in one direction, we'll either have a blown out ground or we'll have a too dark of surface. I'm sorry, we'll have everything on the surface of the snow will just be crunched down too dark, so all of our blacks will be messed up and stuff like that. But both cameras are really holding their own. They're showing a great range of sort of exposure. Like we're not seeing some of the inherent issues that we might have seen a few years ago, where we have the ground just too blown out. Now with the X1000V, again, a great level of clarity and detail. You can really see it on these sort of snowy blocks on the left side of the screen here. This is the AS200. It's a little softer and stuff like that as things get closer to the lens, but the X1000V has the same issue. They kind of have a kind of a soft field of view as we're closer to the camera here. It's not super apparent in this shot, but notice like big chunks of snow where there's a lot of detail and stuff like that. Things get much sharper when we get about 3 to 4 feet. You know what, probably around 4 to 5 feet away from the lens. Anything that's super close to both of these cameras has a tendency to be a little soft. But again, taking a look at the X1000V, look at that tree right over my left shoulder. Just look at all the branch detail on the X1000V. It should be pretty apparent even with the minor YouTube compression on these videos. All the grains of snow that kind of follow the snowboarders as they go by and stuff like that is just, there's a lot more detail in the X1000V. Now the AS200V again is filming at 1080p, but we do have 50 megabits a second. It's nothing to scoff over. Like, we have a nice high quality footage picture here on screen. Color profile is looking great. You might see some issues in the sky with some sort of artifacting and stuff like that. That's not compression issues from YouTube. That's actually within the camera, and what's causing that is it's basically the black and white values being crunched too hard in certain directions. Basically, think of it as like if we had 100 values of in between black and white. If we crunch those too much, it might cause some issues. So this isn't the full audio test, but it'll give us a good sample of what's to come. So just remember what I said and check out the skies and the grounds and stuff like that, and we'll chime back in just a second. So we'll jump back into audio in a bit of a deeper capacity in just a little bit, but what we're going to do is we're going to put both of these cameras in a difficult situation one more time. We have the sun basically shining right into the lenses of both of these cameras. We have this giant reflective mountain. Both of these cameras are doing a great job at sort of exposing for both of those areas. If you look at the X1000V, if you look at the ski trails in the back right there, you'll notice that there's a lot more detail on the X1000V. We can see all of the trails and stuff like that, all the sort of paths that are left by skiers and snowboarders. A lot of the information is there in the AS200V, but like before, it's just mildly softer. Some of the black values and white values are being crunched kind of hard, which is why the snow might seem a little brighter or the blacks might seem a little black. And we're losing a little bit of detail with both of these cameras, but we're not losing so much that we couldn't just sort of bump it up in post a little bit. And then if we did want to bump it up in post, we do have the ability to turn both of these cameras into their flat color mode. And what that's going to do is it's kind of open up that those black and white values that we had before. So you'll notice right now, none of our blacks are as crunched down as they were before. Our whites might seem brighter, but basically it's all washed out because we have a wider range of white values now. We don't have the camera determining what it should crunch and squish that down to for a more appealing image. Now we have the ability to change that range ourselves, and when we do that, a lot of that detail will start to resurface because we won't have such a wide variety of different whites to choose from. We'll just have the limited ones we select. And while I mentioned it a little before, I just kind of wanted to show some of that lens distortion you see on the side of the lens. Both the AS200V and the X1000V have this sort of emphasized lens distortion when we travel further away from the left and right. Basically, when we travel further away from the center. And you see this a lot when you're rotating left and right. You'll see the clouds in the upper right there kind of distort very heavily. And it's sort of the same when we're tilting forward and when we're tilting down and up. You'll see a lot of that distortion happen. And I was afraid that in shots like this that I would just see that distortion all over the place, but you don't really notice it in shots like that. It's more when you're doing those more locked off like tripod shots or those drone sort of pans in left and right. So now we'll move into stabilization. This is a lot of the new footage that we've recorded, and some of the big things we can see here is kind of the warpiness on both of the left and right side of these cameras. Now when we're filming in steady shot, again remember we're going from 170 degree field of view to about 120 degree field of view. And as the footage basically takes that extra space, it tries to lock everything in the center and keep it nice and steady. And while it's doing this, it's also distorting some of the footage just to make sure everything sort of stays nice in the center. However, this will lead to warping filtering along the edges that you'll notice a lot as we're walking here. And another thing you'll notice, as the camera tries to keep the footage nice in the center, when it gets too far away, it might have a jolt or a jitter. So sometimes when you're walking, you'll notice, or as we're taking steps, it'll seem smooth, 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 jitter, smooth, smooth, jitter. This is kind of, you'll notice this kind of like, it kind of pops a little bit as we're following Amanda here, running down sort of Vasquez rocks, and we are kind of shaking all over the place. And what Steady Shot basically is doing for us is it's removing about 60 to 70% of the just sort of the vibrations and jitters that we normally have from walking. So if you notice, we're taking big steps down these rocks, and it does feel much smoother. But now what we're going to do is we're going to mount this to a bike, and this is where I kind of ran into some issues with my refilming, but we'll go over that as we go through it here. But both of these cameras are mounted directly on the bike over the center of the wheel. My only issue is I didn't have the AS200V and the X1000V mounted over the center of the wheel. The AS200V is mounted over the center, while the X1000V is a little far off to the right. Now the X1000V is supposed to be much better with micro vibrations, however, it is getting more of the shake because it is less closer to that center of gravity. So we're going to go over some really shaky grass here, and you're going to notice the X1000V is shaking kind of all over the place. It's maybe 6 inches to the right of the AS200V, but it seems to have made a huge difference because it doesn't have that sort of support base that the AS200V does, being locked right in there. But again, we're right on the bike and we are rolling over everything here. If we had that X1000V just over a little bit, a lot of the stuff would have seemed rock solid, but I don't really know if the X1000V stabilization is any better than the AS200Vs. Again, the X1000V sort of is excelling at the sort of clarity and the detail we are getting. Like even when we are having the shake, if you look at the palm tree, there's a little more detail here. And since we are in Steady Shot and since we are filming at a higher frames per second, we are going to lose some quality and stuff like that. I do wish the X1000V in this example was much better. I can tell you when I hooked up both of these cameras to a drone, the X1000V handled the sort of shake from a drone way better than the AS200. But again, it all has to do with how you're mounting and how you're using these cameras, and if you know the limitation of Steady Shot, you can have some amazing results. So both of these cameras have the ability to film at 120 frames per second. The AS200V is going to do it at 720p, however, and we are no longer in XAVC-S mode when we are doing this. Unfortunately, we have to switch it to MP4, and our bit rates can range from, I think, 28 to 32 megabits a second, depending on our frames per second. Now, the X1000V can do 120 frames per second, but it can do it at 1080p. It still stays at that wide field of view, and we can even play around with having Steady Shot enabled during it. But again, we're going to take a bigger hit in quality. Now you notice, like during this, we're technically having less. What's the word I'm looking for? The footage quality isn't as high, but we still have a great level of sharpness and clarity out of the X1000V. When we start moving into these higher frames per second mode, the AS200V takes quite a big hit. So what we're going to do here is we're going to jump into our audio section. I'm going to go quiet for a little bit, and then we'll jump back in. Take a look at that artifact in the sky in the AS200, and throughout these shots, and the warpiness. And yeah, I'll speak up in just a bit.
I know. I changed my guitar strings. I did all kinds of stuff, and they're saying, I think we just about hit 30 minutes right now. What should we do? I'm good with 30. I say fuck it, we're gonna play a few more, man. Maybe life is like a ride on a freeway, dodging bullets while you're trying to find a way. Everyone's around me, no one does a damn thing, it brings me down. But I won't let that if I see blink. Better you be correct, and if I don't speak, there's a kiss is good, but I won't be. Heard about a reflection of the fire in your eyes as you're staring at the sun.
Alright, the GoPros are both filming in Super View mode for the GoPro Hero 4 Silver. That's 1080p Super mode, 30 frames a second. For the Black, that's 2.7K Super, 30 frames, both in their GoPro color grade. And the Sonys are at their default, same as before, so 4K or 1080 in their color mode and their default lens width. Both of these cameras have an amazing range for audio, especially if you're playing something like an acoustic guitar. Solo in front of the camera sounds fantastic. It has a great level of clarity again. On both of these cameras, you really can't tell the difference if I'm not telling you which camera is recording which audio. Both of them sound almost identical. Personally, there really is no difference in terms of audio between these two cameras. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to move into the low light section of these two cameras. Now the Sony line of cameras has always been fantastic with low light, and that's because both of them pack in a backlit image sensor. And some of the big benefits of this is when we start to get into low light situations, since we have that extra bump on the image sensor itself, it doesn't have to push the grain as heavy to sort of compensate for that. So again, here the color profile is showing a really good range of colors. We have rich reds, rich blues, rich greens all around. The white levels are great. We're not overexposed in any area. Again, sort of the clarity with the X1000V, especially when we're looking at sort of the skyscrapers in the background, much sharper. The building, especially right here, that tan building, we can see all the windows, we can see all of the planes of sort of dividing glass and stuff like that, all the branches and the trees, while the AS200V just has a softer and muddier image. And here we're blowing it up to maybe about 200%, and you just notice a very big difference, especially with that bird flying in the way. We can just sort of see just the levels of detail and clarity on the X1000V. Just looks great. There's a bit of grain being introduced and stuff like that, but the contrast on the city in the background looks fantastic on the X1000V. That same level of clarity is there on the AS200V in terms of the contrast, but we just don't have that sharpness that we're kind of hoping for. Again, we're pointing the camera right at the sun, and just look at the clouds here. We're just getting an amazing amount of detail out of the clouds. X1000V, kind of like pretty much self-explanatory here, just is really good with image quality. The AS200V is a very good competing image. It's a very good image at a $200 price deduction, but in terms of detail, the X1000V always kind of sort of blows me away. Again, we're moving into the lower and lower light section here. I'm noticing a bit more red in the X1000V. You'll notice the kind of blues are a little purple, while the AS200V is maybe a little more higher blue. And the reason why you're seeing my head sort of come in off sync there is because those shots were never meant to be synced. This is sort of our real world test to see what the file sizes would be per minute. And with the X1000V, you can see a lot of heavy grain being introduced into the sky. The AS200V seems to have that same grain there, but it's a little softer and muddier again. And just, again, another observation in differences between these two cameras. Now, one area I always like to test when we're looking at detail and sort of information and stuff like that is like water ripples. The X1000V, if you're looking at the water ripples and just how much more information is there, the AS200V, actually the lake seems much smoother and stuff like that, but we're actually just missing a lot of that sort of subtle detail and stuff like that. It's definitely not an unappealing image, but when we zoom in to, again, 100% here, we can just see the differences in the lake even with the YouTube compression. Now you can't actually zoom with these cameras. This is just something we're doing in post, again, to sort of magnify some of the issues I can see on my end that might not be easily seen on your end. Again, I love this shot. There's a great range of blacks and stuff like that, a great range in the sort of white levels from the sun. We have a good amount of detail in the clouds. I would like to actually see a little more detail in the clouds. I think a little bit is getting too blown out, but it does make for a spectacular image here. So moving into our nighttime test, we're going to lower the frame rate down to 24 frames per second. Now initially I thought this was going to result in a brighter image because basically each frame would have a longer amount of time exposed to the light. But actually, when we did some tests that aren't in this video, we found that when you filmed at 30 frames per second with these cameras, the camera's sort of auto exposure would brighten the image up a little bit, so we would get a little more detail out of things like sort of the ground here. We would be able to see some of those rocks a little bit more. But right now we're going to be filming at 24 frames a second. The X1000V does provide a slightly brighter image over the AS200V. You would have seen that greatly in that last video. But when we move over to something like a more city environment here, the differences are very hard to sort of distinguish. Both of them have a great range. Everything's all lit up. Everything looks really nice. We have that sort of cooler color profile, which looks really good in low light, as we saw in the sunset. And here in the city, we'll notice some blue in the blacks here, but nothing really too outrageous. We have a ton of detail everywhere here in the city, and I don't want to really oversell it, but you know, we have a lot of clarity. We can make out things. And if we were at 30 frames per second, that might be better if we were actually using these cameras as sort of a dash cam or security cam, because the lower the frame rate we make it, the more motion blur we're going to introduce. And if we're moving around and we want to catch a license plate, 30 frames per second should be the bare minimum. But again, look at the parking garage, a ton of detail there. The blacks aren't being crushed, the grain isn't outrageous. We could easily remove that with grain removal software such as Neat Video fairly easily. So one area for me that's really disappointing with both of these cameras outside of the lack of field of view options is sort of the restrictions on time-lapse. Now when we set both of these cameras to do time-lapse, it's not actually doing a time-lapse with the raw photos, which we'll take a look at in a second. The raw photos look great, but when we're doing time-lapse, we're basically taking stills at video quality. So you'll see on the bottom right of our screen here, on both of these cameras, the file size is around 600 kilobytes. So what we're doing is we're taking basically movie quality stills and then just sort of speeding them up in post. Now, I originally thought the idea was maybe this is how the camera gets away. When you put your camera into motion shot LE, I believe it's called, it will actually automatically generate the time-lapse for you, and I figure it needs that sort of extra buffer in the processor power to put those time-lapses together. But when I'm doing a normal time-lapse where I'm taking normal still photography, it still gives me these results because I'm the one now that has to put this time-lapse together. We have a really great image looking here. We have a really great looking image here, but the problem is we don't have any of the range that we get out of a high-res photo. We don't have the sort of color space that we would have if we wanted to make adjustments to this. We're losing a lot of control and options. Again, it's a really nice image, but it's a really nice compressed image, and it would be really nice to have the full range of some of the raw photos, which we're going to start taking a look at here. So both the X1000V and the AS200V share the same exact specs when taking still photography, and that's two resolutions that don't really roll off the tongue very easily, but it's 3952 by 2224. They both use an 8.8 megapixel lens, which is actually smaller than what we've used in previous generations, but when I've kind of compared it to previous gen cameras in some of our other videos, the quality is basically on par even with the smaller megapixel in terms of just like general quality and stuff like that. Both of these cameras, again, the still photography is great. There's not a whole lot of differences, if any. They both pretty much do the same file size, kind of ranges differently depending on the composition, but basically have the same exact specs for still photography. The only benefit with the X1000V is we have the shutter button on top of the camera, so when we press it, everything sort of stays locked in place. Now with the AS200V, when we press that, it actually pushes the camera forward because the button's on the back and it's a little bit sticky, so you have to actually push it and it can generate a good amount of motion blur. Now in this shot here, we're in actually complete darkness, and the X1000V is doing a really good job of taking the shot and getting an amount of light in an area that doesn't have a ton, but we don't actually have any shutter controls or anything like that. If you really wanted to take low light photography with these cameras, especially with the AS200V, I highly recommend using either the LCD remote app or the phone app, just because, again, pressing that button will easily remove some of that sharpness because you're physically pressing that button, and since the camera takes the photo immediately when that button is pushed, chances are it's actually going to be slightly shaking when it takes the photo. And anyway, before you guys run away, I just wanted to share a little bit more information about these two cameras. Both of them come with waterproof housing, however they both have a sort of bubble lens on the front of that housing. Now we didn't really showcase it in this video because we didn't get the opportunity to get the case in time, but those cases are not very good for filming underwater. They're better for just sort of waterproof protection. If you're going to want to do diving with these cameras or underwater photography, you have to get the flat lens housing. There'll be links to how to find those in the information section below this video. Again, that wraps up our side-by-side of the FDR-X1000V up against the AS200V. Big takeaways are the FDR-X1000V just has really good image quality and can do 4K, but for the most part these cameras are kind of on par with each other, just price difference and image quality and some other specs including higher frames per second on the X1000V kind of make the difference. Anyway, and if you own these cameras, be sure to let us know what you think in the comments section below. Be sure to like, subscribe, those things sort of help me out immensely, especially sharing this video. And yeah, if you want to keep up to me with what I'm doing on my day-to-day, Instagram's a really good way to see all the videos and stuff we're coming out with. And we also have a Patreon page, and we have a lot of stuff coming this week. Mark Hog Cam should actually finally be up this week, and there's going to be a lot of cool stuff with that. So yeah, subscribe, keep up to date, Instagram, and yeah, I'll see you all out there.